Christopher Nolan making The Odyssey sounds almost too perfect. A massive myth, a legendary journey, gods, monsters, a war, storms, kingdoms, revenge, and one man trying to cross the impossible distance between himself and home. On the surface, that sounds like exactly the kind of story Nolan was built to tell, but that is also where we need to pump the brakes. Because The Odyssey is not a great story just because Odysseus goes far. It is great because by the time he finally gets back, distance is no longer the only thing separating him from home. Now, I won't take too much of your time, but give me a few minutes and I'll explain why the hardest part of Nolan's The Odyssey may not be the journey itself. It may be what happens after the journey is over. 20 years have passed. The man trying to return is not the same man who left. The wife waiting for him has not been frozen in time. The son he remembers is no longer a child, and life in Ithaca has continued without him. So the question is not whether Nolan can make a blockbuster movie out of The Odyssey. Of course he can. The real question is whether he can make the journey hurt enough that the homecoming becomes the hardest part. Because the most interesting version of The Odyssey is not simply, can Odysseus get home? It is, what happened when he does? And that is why the trailer is interesting. Because at first, it looks like the trailer is selling the obvious version of The Odyssey. The journey, the scale, the myth, the long road back from war. You hear thunder, fire, death. You feel the weight of everything Odysseus has survived, and immediately the movie seems to be promising a massive journey across a world controlled by gods, violence, and forces human beings can barely understand. But the lines that stand out most are not really about the journey, they are about memory. When Odysseus is asked, "Don't you remember?" his answer is not a battle, it is not a monster, it is not a god. He says, "I remember a wife, a son, home." That tells us something important. The trailer may be showing the journey, but it's selling the wound underneath it all. Odysseus is not just trying to survive, he is trying to get back to the version of life that still exists in his mind. A wife, a son, home. But then the trailer quietly challenges that idea. Because Telemachus says, "My dad is coming home." And that line sounds hopeful, but it is also painful. Because what does that even mean when your father has been gone for most of your life? Is he waiting for a man? Or is he waiting for an idea? A legend built from stories, absence, and expectations. And then the trailer goes even further with one of its most important lines. Do you think life goes back to the way it was? That world is gone. That might be the whole movie right there. Because if that line is not just trailer dialogue, then Nolan's The Odyssey is not only asking whether Odysseus can return to Ithaca, it is asking whether the life he remembers is still waiting for him. And that is where the story becomes more interesting than a normal journey home. Because a journey home can end when the hero reaches the door, but in The Odyssey, getting home is only part of the story. And that idea is not something we have to force onto it. Because Homer's Odyssey is already built around changed people. The poem does not begin with the Cyclops, Circe, Calypso, or the Sirens. It begins with absence. Odysseus is gone. His home is under pressure. His wife is surrounded by men trying to take his place. His son is growing up inside the shadow of a father who is more storied in person. And Odysseus himself is trapped far away, still longing for his wife and his country, but no longer simply the man who left Ithaca years ago. That is important. Because The Odyssey is often remembered as a journey story, but it is also a story about what time does to people. Time does not stand still. And Odysseus, even while trying to return, is continuously being shaped by everything he survives along the way. Every island, every delay, every choice, every mistake adds another layer between the man who left and the man trying to come back. So when people describe The Odyssey as a story about going home, that is true, but it is incomplete, because getting home only solves the physical problem. It does not automatically solve he raised 20 years, and it does not make Odysseus the same husband, father, and king Ithaca lost. That starts with Odysseus himself. He left Ithaca as a king, a husband, and a father. By the time he returns, he is also something else. A soldier, a survivor, a liar, a strategist, and a killer. A man who has had to take on many guises in order to stay alive. That is one of the uncomfortable things about Odysseus. His greatest strength is also part of the problem. He adapts. He survives by becoming whatever the moment demands. With the Cyclops, he survives through deception. He does not defeat Polyphemus by being stronger. He defeats him by becoming Nolan. He erases his own name to stay alive, but then his pride pulls the name back out of him. He cannot live as nobody. He has to be Odysseus again, and that choice follows him. So when Odysseus eventually comes home, he is carrying more than memories of the war. He's carrying the cost of every disguise, every loss, every temptation, and every brutal choice that helped him survive. At that point, how could he be the same man? How could anyone be? And that is why finally coming home is not the ultimate victory lap of the story, because the Odysseus who left is not necessarily the same one who came back. And Homer makes that clear. When Odysseus finally reaches Ithaca, he does not immediately run into the house and reveal himself. He comes back disguised. He observes, he tests, he listens. He studies the home he has spent years trying to reach as if it has become enemy territory. And now the question is, how can a man who has taken so many shapes still be recognized by the people who loved him before the journey changed him? That question becomes more important when we look at Penelope. Penelope is often reduced to the simple image of the faithful wife waiting for her husband's long return. But throughout all this waiting, she is surviving her own version of the story. Her husband is gone, her son is vulnerable, her house is full of men trying to take control of her future. So Penelope is not passive, she is strategic. She delays, she manages appearance, she buys time. She survives inside a prison that still looks like her home. And when Odysseus finally comes back, he is not the only one carrying 20 years. Penelope carries them too. She has spent 20 years living with uncertainty, pressure, and the memory of a husband who may be dead, changed, or impossible to recover. So if Odysseus returns expecting the woman he left behind, that is already a problem. And Homer understands this. That is why Penelope does not simply accept Odysseus the moment he appears. She tests him. When a man finally stands in front of her claiming to be the husband she lost, she is not only asking, "Is this Odysseus?" What she really wants to know is this still my Odysseus? And that is why the marriage bed matters so much. Penelope tests him by suggesting that their marriage bed be moved, and Odysseus reacts with anger, because the bed is not just furniture, it is something only they truly understand, because Odysseus carved the bed from a living, rooted olive tree and built the bedroom around it. That is what makes the reunion powerful, not because Penelope simply waited, but because after 20 years, she still needs proof that the man who returns is connected to the life they built before he left. And that is exactly the kind of thing Nolan's movie cannot afford to flatten. Because if Penelope is only treated as a prize at the end of the journey, the story becomes less significant. But if she is treated as someone who has also been changed by time, then the homecoming becomes much more complicated. Odysseus is not just returning to a wife, he is returning to another survivor. And then there is Telemachus. If Odysseus and Penelope are both carrying 20 years in different ways, Telemachus is carrying something even more difficult. He is carrying the absence of a father he only knows through stories, because he was only a few months old when Odysseus left for the Trojan War. That is what makes the trailer line so interesting when he says, "My dad is coming home." Because on the surface, that sounds like hope, but what does "my dad" means when your father has been gone for most of your life? Telemachus is not waiting for a man he actually knows, he is waiting for a name, a reputation, a missing place at the center of the house. For him, Odysseus is not just a father, he is an idea of a father. A legend everyone talk about, but almost no one can give back to him. So when Odysseus returns, Telemachus is not just meeting his father, he is meeting the man who has been used to explain the pain of his whole life. Why the house is under threat, why his mother is trapped in uncertainty, why men disrespect him and his own home, why he grew up surrounded by stories of a king but without the protection of one. That is a lot to put on one reunion. And Homer understands that Telemachus also has to change. At the beginning, he is young, angry, and trapped between boyhood and adulthood. He is expected to be the son of Odysseus, but he has never really been raised by Odysseus. So part of his story is not just waiting for his father, it is becoming someone who can stand beside him. That makes the homecoming more layered, because Odysseus is not returning to the child he left behind. He is returning to a son who has grown up inside the damage of his absence. And Telemachus is being forced to compare the men in front of him with the legend he has been carrying for years. The father-son reunion should be beautiful, but it should also feel strange, because Odysseus has to become real to a son who mostly knew him as a story. And Telemachus has to accept that the father he imagined may not be exactly the father who came back. That is another reason why the Odyssey is not just about reaching Ithaca, because every person waiting in Ithaca has been shaped by the waiting. Penelope has survived through strategy, Telemachus has grown up through absence, and Odysseus returns to both of them with the expectation that home will still know him. But home has been changing too, and that brings us to Ithaca itself. Home is not only Penelope, it is not only Telemachus, it is also the kingdom Odysseus left behind. And that kingdom has not been waiting quietly for 20 years. In Odysseus' absence, Ithaca has become unstable. The suitors represent a power vacuum. That is why the trailer line matters when someone says Ithaca's a kingdom waiting for a king. Because that sounds noble. It sounds like the kingdom is simply waiting for Odysseus to walk back in and restore order. But that is not really how power works. When someone disappears for 20 years, other people adjust. They move closer to the throne, they test the boundaries, and in the Odyssey, that is exactly what the suitors do. They eat through Odysseus' house, they pressure Penelope, they disrespect Telemachus, they act as if his absence has already become permission. So when Odysseus returns, he is not just coming home to his family, he is coming home to a house that has been occupied, a kingdom that has been weakened, a social order that has already started to reorganize itself around the assumption that he is never coming back. That makes his return dangerous, because if Odysseus comes back, then everything has to be answered for. Every insult, every theft, every betrayal, every person who treated his absence like an opportunity. And the trailer seems aware of that too. When someone asks if he's bringing vengeance, the answer is not small. Bringing it all. That sounds like a promise, but it also sounds like a warning. Because if Odysseus returns as a changed man, and Ithaca has become a changed place, then the reunion between king and kingdom cannot be peaceful by default. It becomes a collision. And Homer does not treat that collision as simple either. After Odysseus kills the suitors, the story does not just turn into a happy ending. The families of the dead rise up. More violence threatens to follow the violence that already happened. Peace has to be forced back into Ithaca. So even when Odysseus wins, the kingdom still has to survive his return. Odysseus coming home does not magically restore the old world. In some ways, it destroys the false version of peace that grew in his absence. And that brings us back to the trailer's most important warning. Do you think life goes back to the way it was? That world is gone. A king can return, but the world he left behind cannot simply be reloaded from an old memory. Too much has happened, too many choices have been made. And once Odysseus comes back, what happens when the people realize that he cannot bring Ithaca back to what it once was? And this is where Nolan's adaptation becomes interesting. The trailer could be misleading. The final film could understand all of this perfectly. But based on what the Odyssey is, and based on what the trailer seems to be promising, this is a thing the movie has to get right. It cannot let the journey become bigger than the homecoming. Because with a story like this, the easy temptation is obvious. Show the ships, show the storms, show the gods, show the monsters, show the scale. And to be clear, that should be there. This is the Odyssey. The myth should feel massive. The journey should feel impossible. The world should feel dangerous, ancient, strange, and controlled by force human beings do not fully understand. But all of that only matters if it keeps pointing back to the same wound. Home. Not home as a location. Home as memory. Home as expectation. Home as the version of life Odysseus thinks he's trying to recover. That is the risk. Because if the movie becomes only a chain of spectacular obstacles, then the Odyssey becomes smaller than it should be. It becomes a man going from one event to another until he finally reaches the destination. But the stronger version asks what each obstacle does to him. What does the war leave behind? What does deception cost him? What does temptation reveal about him? What does loss take from him? What does survival turn him into? Because by the time he reaches Ithaca, we should feel that the journey has not just delayed him, it has altered him. That is why the homecoming has to feel like the final test, not just the ending. Odysseus should not arrive as if the story is finally over. He should arrive as a man carrying every choice that helped him survive. And that is also where the trailer's warning becomes so important. Do you think life goes back to the way it was? That world is gone. That line should not just be dramatic trailer dialogue. It should be the question sitting underneath the whole movie. Because if that world is gone, then Odysseus is not simply trying to reclaim a throne. He is trying to face the distance between the life he remembers and the life that actually exists. And that is much harder to dramatize than a monster. A monster can be defeated, a storm can be survived, a god can be resisted. But what do you do when the thing you spent 20 years trying to reach has changed without you? What do you do when the people you love have been shaped by your absence? What do you do when you are still chasing a home that only exists in memory? That is the psychological danger of the Odyssey, and that is the adaptation risk. Nolan does not have to prove he can make this story feel big. That part feels almost guaranteed. He has to prove that all the bigness is serving something more difficult. Because if the movie gets that right, then the Odyssey will not just feel like a massive journey. It will feel like a story about the cost of surviving long enough to come home. And that is why the story is so difficult. Returning means facing the people who had to keep living without you. Returning means discovering that the place you carried in your mind may not match the place that actually survived. Returning means realizing that the version of yourself you preserved in memory may not be the version everyone else now sees. That is why the idea of home becomes so complicated. Home is a relationship between memory and reality, and after 20 years, that relationship is fragile. Odysseus wants to return to his wife, his son, and his kingdom, but his wife has become another survivor. His son has grown up with his absence. His kingdom has learned to function without him, and Odysseus himself has become a man shaped by war, loss, deception, temptation, and violence. So when the trailer says, "That world is gone," that should not just be treated like a dramatic line. That should be the heart of the movie. Because the real tragedy is not that Odysseus cannot get home. The real tragedy is that by the time he gets there, the home he remembers may already belong to the past. And if Nolan understands that, then the Odyssey could be more than a massive mythological blockbuster. It could be a story about what time takes from people, what survival cost, what absence does to a family, and what happens when someone finally returns to the life they spent years imagining, only to realize that everyone inside that life has changed. That is the version of the Odyssey I hope this movie is chasing. Not just the ships, not just the monsters, not just the gods, not just the scale, but the uncomfortable question underneath all of it. After everything Odysseus has done to survive the journey home, can he still belong there once he arrives? If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications so you don't miss any of my future videos. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.